The sky over France was calm for exactly 1 second. Then a P-51 Mustang exploded into fire. One moment it was leading the formation. The next, black smoke poured from its engine, flames licking back toward the cockpit. German territory lay below, and one American pilot was about to disappear into enemy hands unless someone did the impossible. This story begins in August 1944, when the air war over Europe had turned brutal, personal, and unforgiving. American fighters were no longer just escorting bombers. They were flying low, hunting trains, trucks, and rail yards, strafing anything that moved, flying so low they could see faces on the ground, and the Germans knew it. They learned to hide their guns, in barns, in haystacks, inside rail cars marked with red crosses. By that summer, pilots didn't fear the sky anymore. They feared what was waiting on the ground. Late in the afternoon, a small flight of P-51 Mustangs dropped down toward a rail line in occupied France. The lead aircraft belonged to a squadron commander, a fast-rising ace, aggressive, confident, respected by everyone who flew with him. He wasn't supposed to be there that day. He could have stayed behind, sent younger pilots instead. But that wasn't who he was. As the Mustangs lined up for the attack, the trap was sprung. The sides of a rail car slammed open. Anti-aircraft guns were already aimed. The sky filled with fire. Tracers ripped upward at point-blank range. One Mustang took a direct hit. The engine coughed, then burst into flames. Coolant streamed into the air like white smoke. The aircraft lurched, losing power, losing altitude. The squadron commander fought the controls, but there was no saving it. Below him, wheat fields, trees, enemy territory. Behind him, his wingman, watching it all happen. Lieutenant Royce Priest was 21 years old. He had only been in combat for a short time, but he already knew what this meant. When a pilot went down behind German lines, the chances were grim. Capture, prison camps, years of waiting if he survived at all. The burning Mustang slipped below the tree line and vanished. Radio discipline demanded one thing: mark the position and leave. Everyone knew the rule. You don't land in enemy territory. You don't try to rescue someone with a one-seat fighter. You don't gamble another aircraft and another pilot. Priest heard the order over the radio. Abort. Head home. His hand hovered near the switch and stopped. He pushed the nose down. The wheat field rushed up to meet him. A P-51 was never meant to land like this. Its engine sat low. Its radiator hung beneath the belly like a weak point waiting to be torn open. The landing gear was built for clean runways, not uneven farmland hiding rocks and ruts. Priest knew all of that. He did it anyway. Flaps down. Speed bleeding off. The nose blocking his view. He judged height by the blur of wheat beside his wing. The wheels slammed into the field. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled. Wheat stalks whipped against the fuselage as he stood on the brakes. Dirt sprayed. The Mustang shuddered to a stop, pointed back toward the sky he'd just left. Above him, the remaining fighters circled in disbelief. Seconds later, movement appeared on a nearby road. A German truck, fast, headed straight for the field. Then another, then a motorcycle. Enemy soldiers were converging. The Mustangs overhead didn't hesitate. They dove, guns blazing. Tracers stitched across the road. The first truck erupted in flame and skidded into a ditch. The second slowed as soldiers bailed out and spread into the wheat. Time was collapsing. Priest stood in his cockpit, scanning the tree line where smoke still drifted upward. Nothing. Every pilot carried thermite grenades to destroy their aircraft after a crash. If the squadron commander was doing that now, he'd be visible any second. Priest did the math without writing it down. Soft ground. Short field. Overweight takeoff if this worked at all. Still nothing. The Germans were closer now. You could see helmets bobbing through the wheat. Then a figure broke from the trees, running. Major Burt Marshall, alive, furious. He waved his arms, not in thanks, but in command. Leave. Get out. Now. Priest didn't argue. He climbed out of the cockpit, removed his parachute, dropped it on the wing. Then he pulled off his life raft and threw it into the wheat. There was no confusion about the message. If this plane didn't take off, they were both done. Marshall stopped running. For a moment, the field went strangely still, except for gunfire in the distance and the roar of engines overhead. Then Marshall sprinted the last yards and climbed onto the wing. A P-51 cockpit is barely wide enough for one man. It is tight even with perfect conditions. What followed was not procedure. It was desperation. Marshall slid down first, cramming himself as low as possible, legs jammed beneath the panel. Priest climbed in after him, settling onto his commander's lap, knees tight against the control stick, shoulders pressed into Marshall's chest. They were locked together, breathing shallow, soaked in sweat, before the canopy even closed. Priest pulled it shut. There was barely space to breathe. He pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin engine roared. The Mustang surged ahead, dragging through the weep like it didn't want to leave. Speed climbed painfully slow. The end of the field rushed toward them. Priest pulled back. The wheels left the ground. The stall warning screamed. Trees scraped past beneath them. Then air. They were flying. Behind them, German soldiers burst from the wheat and watched the impossible climb away. But the danger wasn't over, not even close. The Mustang was overloaded. The engines strained. Debris clogged the radiator. The temperature needle crept higher with every mile. Inside the cockpit, heat became unbearable. Marshall couldn't move. Blood drained from his legs. Pain turned to numbness. Priest flew with inches to spare. The stick barely moved between his knees. One wrong motion could end everything. The escort fighters slid into position on either side. No ammo left, guarding a miracle held together by luck and skill. France slipped beneath them. Flak positions, airfields, roads full of enemies who never knew how close they came. After nearly an hour, the coastline appeared. Friendly territory. Relief lasted seconds. Ahead lay the English Channel. Cold water, no rafts, no parachutes. The engine temperature hit the red. Priest chose speed. Better to ditch near rescue boats than land back among the Germans. Halfway across the water, the engine began to cough. Each misfire felt like a countdown. Then England. White cliffs, green fields, still flying. The runway was waiting, emergency crews already in place. Priest brought the Mustang in fast, heavy, barely under control. The wheels hit concrete, the engine sputtered, and finally stopped. Ground crews ran forward, then froze. Two men unfolded from a cockpit built for one. Marshall collapsed, unable to feel his legs. Priest climbed down, shaking, drenched, alive. Word spread through the base in minutes. A single-seat fighter had landed behind enemy lines, taken on a second pilot, and flown home. No one had ever done it before, and no one knew what would happen next, because courage had just collided with the rulebook, and somewhere above it all, a decision was waiting. The celebration didn't last. On the flight line, ground crews stared at the Mustang like it had just landed from another planet. Wheat stalks jammed into the landing gear, dirt packed into the radiator, oil streaked along the cowling where the engine had nearly torn itself apart. Mechanics shook their heads, quietly amazed it had stayed alive long enough to reach England. But above the hangars, in offices filled with maps and paperwork, the mood was very different. Because what Lieutenant Royce Priest had done was not just dangerous. It was illegal. He had ignored a direct order in combat. He had landed a valuable fighter behind enemy lines. He had risked turning one prisoner into two dead pilots. Every rule said there should be consequences. Major Burt Marshall, once his legs recovered, walked with a slight limp into the debriefing room. His flight suit was still stained with soot from the burning Mustang he'd destroyed in France. He didn't look like a man who had just been rescued. He looked like a commander who knew the weight of what had happened. Marshall gave his report honestly. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't soften it. He stated clearly that he had ordered Priest to abort twice and that Priest had disobeyed him twice. No excuses. No hero speech. Just facts. Those facts traveled fast. By the next morning, the story had climbed the chain of command and landed on the desk of the man who ran the entire air war in Europe, General James Doolittle. Doolittle knew risk. He knew what it meant to gamble aircraft and lives on impossible missions. 2 years earlier, he had launched bombers from an aircraft carrier, knowing none of them could return. He had expected punishment for it. Instead, history had called it bravery. Now, he stared at a different kind of gamble. A young lieutenant had made a decision that should have ended in disaster, but didn't. Doolittle asked for everything: radio logs, witness statements, maintenance reports. He read how the Mustang's engine had been seconds from seizure, how the escort pilots had burned their last ammunition keeping German soldiers away, how the cockpit measurements showed there should not have been room for 2 men to breathe, let alone fly. The reports didn't exaggerate. They didn't need to. This wasn't luck alone. It was skill under pressure. Judgment made in seconds, and a refusal to leave a man behind. But the law was still the law. If Doolittle punished Priest, it would send a clear message: discipline mattered more than heroics. The rules existed for a reason. If he rewarded Priest, it would send a different message, that pilots might be tempted to try the impossible again and next time fail. The 8th Air Force was already bleeding experienced men. Training replacements took time they didn't have. Doolittle waited. 3 days passed. Then he made his decision. There would be no court-martial. Instead, Lieutenant Royce Priest would receive a medal for valor, but not the one everyone expected. The paperwork moved carefully, quietly. Priest was recommended for the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for bravery. It praised his courage, his flying skill, his willingness to risk everything for a fellow pilot, and it avoided turning his act into a rule others might try to follow. When the ceremony was scheduled, Priest expected the worst. He had spent days waiting for orders that might end his career. When he was told to report to the flight line in dress uniform, he assumed it was for discipline. The morning of September 21, 1944, the men of the 355 Fighter Group gathered under a clear sky. Engines were silent. Ground crews stopped working. Pilots lined up shoulder to shoulder. General Doolittle stood at the front. When Priest stepped forward, he felt every eye on him. He stood at attention, unsure what would come next. Doolittle pinned the medal to his chest. Then he leaned in and spoke quietly. Words meant only for Priest. He told him the truth. What he had done was brave. And it was also reckless. The medal honored the courage. The absence of a higher one honored the lesson. Priest nodded. He didn't argue. He had survived France. He had saved his commander. Anything beyond that felt like borrowed time. The story spread anyway. Pilots talked. Mechanics talked. Squadrons across the 8th Air Force heard about the Mustang that flew home with 2 men inside it, and some of them remembered it. 10 days later, another pilot landed in occupied France to rescue a downed wingman. His aircraft sank into mud. Both men escaped on foot. Weeks later, 2 more tried. 1 succeeded, 1 failed. 2 pilots went into captivity. The gamble was becoming clear. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But no order was ever written banning it. Commanders understood something no regulation could capture. In the air war, loyalty between pilots could outweigh fear of punishment. Major Burt Marshall returned to combat almost immediately. His legs recovered fully. He kept flying, kept leading. His men followed him with even more confidence than before. They had seen what loyalty looked like when everything went wrong. He added more victories, earned another medal, eventually took over higher command. Lieutenant Royce Priest kept flying too. He didn't talk about the rescue unless asked. When he did, he shifted credit to the escort pilots who strafed the trucks, to the mechanics who rebuilt the Mustang, to luck. He never called himself a hero. The war rolled on. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the 8th Air Force had documented several successful single-seat rescues. More attempts had failed. The cost was real, the risk undeniable, but the bond between pilots remained unchanged. Years later, long after the engines fell silent, Priest wrote a letter to Marshall's son. In it, he explained something he had never said out loud. He hadn't calculated the odds. He hadn't thought about medals or punishment. He had seen his hero fall. and he had refused to leave him behind. Royce Priest lived a long life, so did Burt Marshall. They carried the memory of that cockpit, the heat, the fear, the weight of another man's life until the end. The Mustang that saved them disappeared into history, sold, scrapped, forgotten. But the story didn't. It passed from pilot to pilot, from father to son, from archive to memory. 2 American pilots, 1 German Wheatfield, 1 single-seat fighter, and a decision made in seconds that changed everything. The war did not pause to reflect on miracles. While the story of the overloaded Mustang spread quietly through fighter groups, missions continued the next morning. And the morning after that, engines started. Crews climbed into cockpits. Radios crackled with familiar voices that might not return by nightfall. For the men of the 8th Air Force, survival was never a guarantee. It was a temporary condition. Royce Priest went back into that rhythm almost immediately. Another briefing, another map covered in red grease pencil lines, another long walk to a P-51 waiting on the hard stand. No speeches, no applause, just another mission number written on a clipboard. Yet something had changed. Pilots looked at him differently now, not with envy, not with hero worship, with quiet awareness. They knew what he had done. They knew how close it had come to failing. And they knew that if it had been them burning over France, Priest would have tried the same thing. That knowledge mattered. In the air, fear is personal. You sit alone, strapped to an engine, surrounded by empty sky. When something goes wrong, it's just you and your choices. Knowing someone else might risk everything for you didn't remove fear, but it gave it a boundary. Marshall understood this better than anyone. As squadron commander, he now carried a complicated burden. His life had been saved by a decision he had ordered not to happen. He owed his survival to disobedience. That reality never sat comfortably with him. When later rescue attempts failed, when pilots were captured or aircraft lost, Marshall felt the weight of precedent. He never encouraged such landings. He never officially approved them. But he also never condemned the instinct behind them. He had lived inside that cockpit. He knew what loyalty felt like when rules collapsed. By late 1944, the air war was changing. German resistance weakened, but danger remained sharp and unpredictable. Flak still reached up from fields and forests. Fighters still pounced on the unwary. Weather killed as many men as bullets. Priest survived his tour. So did Marshall. Many others didn't. When the war finally ended, there was no single moment of relief, just a gradual realization that tomorrow would not involve engines warming on cold concrete. Men went home carrying silence where noise had lived for years. For Priest, the rescue became something he didn't lead with. It wasn't his introduction. It wasn't his identity. He built a long career in the Air Force, flying aircraft that dwarfed the Mustang in speed and complexity. Jets replaced propellers. Altitude replaced treetops. But the lessons of that wheatfield followed him. He trained pilots. He advised foreign air forces. He flew presidents and generals. And when young aviators asked him about fear, he didn't talk about medals. He talked about judgment. About choosing when to act and when not to, about knowing the cost of both decisions. Marshall's career climbed as well. Leadership roles, command positions, responsibility that extended far beyond a single cockpit. His reputation followed him, not just as an ace, but as a commander whose men trusted him deeply. Years later, when historians asked about that day in France, Marshall never framed himself as the center of the story. He talked about the moment he saw Priest throw away his parachute. That was the moment, he said, when he realized the argument was over. No orders mattered after that. Time moved on, as it always does. The war faded into textbooks. The P-51 became a museum icon. New generations learned about World War II through grainy footage and quiet narration. But the rescue didn't disappear. It lingered in letters, in squadron reunions, in conversations that started with, "Did you ever hear about the Mustang that came back with 2 pilots inside?" In 2002, near the end of his life, Royce Priest finally put everything on paper. He wrote to Marshall's son, not for history, but for family. He described the fear plainly, the uncertainty, the waiting afterward, when he didn't know if his reward would be a medal or a prison sentence. He admitted something else too. The flight itself had been terrifying, but the days afterward, the silence, the not knowing that had been worse. Priest passed away in 2004. His obituary spoke of rank, service, family. Like most obituaries spoke of rank, service, family. Like most obituaries, it struggled to compress a life into paragraphs. It did not mention the wheat field. It did not mention the cockpit. It did not mention the moment when two men decided that rules could bend, but loyalty would not. Bert Marshall lived on as well, carrying his own version of the memory. He never forgot the pressure of Priest's weight, the numbness in his legs, the heat trapped under the canopy. Those sensations never truly leave a person. They become part of who you are. Today there is no monument for that Mustang, no plaque in a museum explaining how it defied physics and probability. The aircraft itself vanished, like so many others, reduced to scrap or scattered across private collections. But stories don't need aluminum to survive. They live in voices. They live in choices repeated under pressure. They live in the understanding that war is not only about strategy and orders, but about moments when a single human decision outweighs everything else. Two pilots, one seat, one chance, and a flight that should never have worked but did. Long after the guns went quiet, the question never really disappeared. What makes a man break the rules in war? Not out of anger, not out of panic, but with a calm certainty that this is the only choice he can live with. For Royce Priest, that answer followed him for decades. Whenever the rescue came up at reunions, in interviews, in quiet conversations with younger pilots, people expected a dramatic explanation. Something about bravery, something about destiny. He never gave them that. He talked instead about habit, about how pilots watch each other in the air, how they learn voices on the radio, how a leader's calm tone during danger becomes something you rely on without realizing it, how trust builds mission after mission until it feels physical, like a weight in your chest. By August 1944, Bert Marshall wasn't just a squadron commander. He was the voice that steadied the formation when flak burst too close, the pilot whose tactics worked, the man others followed without question. When that voice suddenly vanished behind a tree line in enemy territory, something inside Priest rejected the idea of simply flying away, not logically, instinctively. That instinct didn't disappear when the war ended. Priest saw it again while training new pilots in the jet age. Different aircraft, different speeds, same pressures. Young men facing fear at altitude, trying to balance procedure with reality. He warned them about heroics, but he also told them something else. There will be moments, he said, when the checklist runs out. Moments when no manual can tell you what the right answer is. Those moments define you. For Bert Marshall, the rescue left a different mark. As a commander, he became more aware of the weight his decisions carried, not just tactically but personally. Every order he gave had a human cost attached to it. Every mission risked creating another impossible choice for someone else. He never forgot that he had once ordered a man to leave him behind and that the man had refused. That knowledge shaped how he led. He listened more closely, he questioned assumptions, he understood that courage didn't always look like obedience. Years after the war, historians tried to place the rescue into neat categories. Was it a turning point? Did it change policy? Did it inspire doctrine? The answer was uncomfortable. No, it changed nothing on paper. There was no new regulation allowing single-seat rescues, no official tactic added to manuals, no training syllabus explaining how to cram two men into a cockpit under fire, because the truth was simpler and harder to accept. What Priest did could not be standardized. It depended on timing, terrain, skill, luck, weather, enemy movement, and a level of trust that cannot be ordered or taught. For every rescue that succeeded, another failed. For every story that ended with applause, there was one that ended behind barbed wire. Commanders knew this. That's why the act remained unofficial, neither forbidden nor encouraged. A quiet understanding. Do it if you must. Live with the result. As decades passed, the men who had flown those missions began to fade. Reunions grew smaller. Stories repeated themselves to thinner crowds. The world moved on to new wars, new machines, new headlines. But among those who knew aviation, the story endured. Not because it was flashy, because it was raw. A single-seat fighter breaking every assumption about what was possible. A pilot making a decision that balanced on seconds. A commander realizing that leadership sometimes means being saved by those you lead. In classrooms and hangars, instructors would mention it as a cautionary tale, not go and do the same, but understand what it costs. Understand what it costs. Understand that courage can win, but it never guarantees safety. The wheat field in France returned to quiet after the war. Crops grew again. Seasons passed. No marker remains to show where a Mustang once struggled into the air, overloaded and overheating. The land forgot, but the sky remembered. Every pilot who heard the story pictured the same thing, a needle creeping toward red, trees rushing closer, an aircraft lifting just enough to clear them. A moment where physics hesitated, and human will pushed through. By the time the war finally settled into memory, most people would never hear this story. There was no parade for a Mustang that came home carrying 2 men, no monument raised in a wheat field in France. No chapter in school books describing a cockpit built for one that saved 2 lives, and maybe that is fitting, because this story was never about recognition. It was about a moment when fear, loyalty and instinct collided, and one man chose not to turn away. Royce Priest never called what he did heroic. When asked, he usually shifted the focus. He talked about the escort pilots who emptied their guns to keep German soldiers back. He talked about the mechanics who rebuilt an engine that should have seized in midair. He talked about luck, but deep down he understood something most people never experience. There are moments in war when you act not because you believe you will succeed, but because you cannot live with the alternative. Bert Marshall understood that too. He carried the memory of that cockpit through the rest of his life. The pressure, the heat, the helplessness. The realization that survival sometimes depends on someone else breaking the rules for you. After the war, both men went on with their lives, careers, families, responsibilities far removed from burning engines and wheat fields under fire. Yet the bond between them never faded. It had been forged in the most unforgiving way possible. 2 men compressed into a space too small for both, flying over enemy land with nothing left to lose. When Priest passed away in 2004, his obituary listed his rank, his service, his family. It read like many others written for men of his generation, dignified, restrained, incomplete. It did not mention the day he landed in France under fire. It did not mention the decision that risked everything, because some stories resist being reduced to lines of text. The P-51 Mustang that carried them home vanished into history. Sold, scrapped, forgotten as an object, but what it represented did not vanish. It lived on in the pilots who heard the story and quietly recalibrated what loyalty meant, in commanders who understood that rules exist, but humanity does too, in listeners who realize that war is not only shaped by strategy and firepower, but by individual choices made under bearable pressure. 2 American pilots were captured by fate that day. And then they escaped it. They squeezed into a single-seat fighter. They flew home together. And for a few minutes over France, everything we think we know about limits of machines, of rules, of courage, was rewritten. If this story kept you watching, take a moment and support the channel. Hit like so this story reaches more people. Subscribe if you believe these moments of history matter. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Because these stories belong to all of us. Thank you for staying with us, and thank you for remembering.